Welcome to China in the News. I'm Christine. Today, we're exploring a story about Apple, Alibaba, and the rollout of AI services in China. Joining me is my co host, Professor Doug Guthrie, a professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management and an expert on U.S. China relations.
How are you, Christine? Great to see you again.
Thank you. Um, Apple recently announced it has partnered with Alibaba to launch its AI service called Apple Intelligence in China. Together, they submitted materials for regulatory approval. It's interesting to know that Apple actually initially explored other partners, including Baidu and DeepSeek, but those partnerships didn't materialize. Doug, when I led the EBM team for Apple in China, we partnered with AutoNavi, a subsidiary of Alibaba, for maps, data, and services. We needed a local partner to comply with Chinese regulations. Could you unpack why companies like Apple often have to rely on local partners to operate in China?
Sure. It's a great question, and these are important topics, and you and I dealt with this a lot when we were both at Apple, as you mentioned, and but a lot of companies, especially in the technology space, but a lot of companies for many years really required partnerships. So China's regulatory environment, makes it clear that foreign companies that want to collaborate, that want to be in China's market for sensitive sectors, you have to collaborate with local firms, right? And so these are sectors like telecom and AI. Um, and it ensures that there's compliance with data sovereignty and laws and allows the government to maintain control over how data is stored and used within its borders. Now, as you and I have discussed in the past, like there has been an evolution in this period. It used to be the case before China entered the WTO that just about any company that wanted to be in China. I mean, light industry goods were sort of separated from this. But if you wanted a significant presence in China and wanted access to the Chinese market, in addition to just being able to use the Chinese manufacturing supply chain, you had to have a joint venture, you had to have a foreign partner, you had to have technology transfer agreements, et cetera. Then when China entered the WTO, it became illegal to have a quid pro quo for market access. And so, this kind of opened the markets in the 2001 era on. We saw a lot of openness, and we saw companies like Apple that for many years didn't have any kinds of investments like joint venture contracts and such. But in as sensitive sectors like high tech, telecom, AI, where China's very interested in the control over the flow of data and those kinds of issues, they've maintained that specific area of control. And so you've got to have local partnerships. And so this case fits that.
When it comes to regulation, what does China's cybersecurity regulators typically look for and evaluate when reviewing proposals like this?
So they're primarily focused on things like data security, potential national security risks, the alignment of technology with China's border goals for tech self-sufficiency. Um, and so, you know, they have to assess whether the service prioritizes Chinese users and promotes domestic innovation. And so again, this is really the key things are really about control over the flow of data and the control over technological development and self-sufficiency. But there are self-serving interests here that are really also about innovation and the ways in which companies like Alibaba can be leaders in the high-tech field. And so there are the very specific goals about data security and control, but there's also issues about the Chinese government favoring its companies in terms of innovation and development.
Well, one thing about cybersecurity regulations, I know that DeepSeek self-censored, right? The big three T's, they don't talk about it, Tiananmen Square, Taiwan, and Tibet. And anytime that someone in US asks that question, they politely say, let's talk about something else.
Yeah, I mean, and there's been a long, long history of this, like, I mean, I think you and I have discussed it before, but like, I remember back in the time when, when the internet and Google were relatively new things. And, if you got on the internet and got on Google and you entered Tiananmen and you'd see pictures of the Tiananmen Square and Tiananmen massacre and, the individuals staring down the tanks. And then I would get on a plane and go to China and just as an experiment, do the same thing. And you wouldn't see those pictures. You would see a beautiful pictures of Mao's mausoleum. And so there's clearly censorship that was happening. And this led to a conflict between Google and China, and eventually Google getting kicked out of and leaving China, or going to Hong Kong and then really having to self-censor. And so to your point, the Chinese companies know this very well. And so they've already been in the space of self-censoring. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that that's happening.
Let's dig into the partnership a bit. What does a typical collaboration between a foreign company like Apple and a Chinese firm like Alibaba entail?
So again, here's where things get a little complicated just depending on what sector you're in. So partnerships often involve shared resources, co-development of technologies, and profit sharing agreements. They also include compliance provisions where the Chinese partner assumes responsibility for meeting local regulatory requirements. Um, the words get a little dicey here because, again, when in the 1990s, before China entered the WTO, they were just very clear. Like, if you want to be in China and you want to be in this sector, you're going to have a joint venture, and we're going to, have, the Chinese company or the new formed company has close oversight by the Chinese partner, and et cetera, et cetera. Today, it's illegal by WTO standards to have a quid pro quo for market access. So you can't define things that way. But the Chinese government has lots of ways that it can make life very difficult for different companies, and particularly in this area of the flow of data and AI technology and just high tech areas. They can make it very clear for companies like Apple, like, if you don't, it would be in your best interest, if you want to operate in China, that you have a partner like Alibaba, and that you're really sharing resources, and you're thinking about co-development of technology and profit sharing, et cetera. And so, again, you don't have to, there are lots of ways that the Chinese government can make it difficult for companies if they don't do this right, without requiring things like a joint venture. And they're very good at it.
Well, we're talking about AI, so you can't talk about AI in 2025 without talking about DeepSeek. It's a startup whose innovation in AI really positioning itself as a very strong challenger to open AI's dominance. Apple actually briefly considered them as a partner, but due to its unique approach to uh, because of the cost and being able to embed in devices. So, Doug, I'm curious, did DeepSeek's advancement rely on semiconductor acquired from Nvidia before the export ban? Or was it their work truly a groundbreaking development that set them apart?
Well, I mean, first of all, DeepSeek very likely stockpiled chips prior to the ban. And this is a common strategy among Chinese firms anticipating the restrictions. And, everybody was watching this field unfold. Um, and, if you were in that space, you could sort of predict that things were going to get a lot more tense. I don't think people really predicted just how serious the bans were going to be. But, clearly people in China and DeepSeek probably like were recognizing that this was coming, and they were stockpiling the chips ahead of time. And so while their approach was innovative, it wasn't entirely groundbreaking in a global context. And the buzz may have been a bit inflated due to recent geopolitical tensions. So, the DeepSeek has really come out of the shadows in a very, very important, intense time between U.S.-China relations. I mean, you and I have discussed this. I think U.S.-China relations are at a very bad point, maybe the worst that they've been in 30 years. And things have gotten more and more tense since 2016, and then the initial tariffs in 2018-19, and then the CHIPS Act, et cetera. And so this is definitely a tense time. And so clearly, DeepSeek was operating in the shadows and probably was stockpiling chips. So yeah, they were seeing it coming.
Nevertheless, they were celebrated as national heroes because people are really, really proud of their accomplishment.
Yeah.
However, they reportedly use a technique called distillation to simplify their model development significantly. So, reported that their most recent model was able to be created under $6 million. Could you explain what that means and how impactful it is in the broader AI landscape?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great question. And again, this is part of why this is just shaking the entire world, because they've come out with something that's very powerful, and to your point, have done it for much more cheaply than people thought they would. So to your question, what is distillation? Refers to creating smaller, more efficient AI models by training them to replicate the outputs of larger models. And so it's impactful because it reduces computational costs and enables wider development of AI technologies and deployment of those technologies, particularly in hardware constrained environments. Right. And so, if China's not getting access to chips, and they've been stockpiling some of those chips, but they still need to be very efficient with how they're using them. And so think of it like prepare a detailed 10-hour lecture. The professor spends a significant amount of time to create the content and the the body of the lecture, and then the TA takes the lecture, distills the key points, and produces a concise study sheet that students can use effectively in much less time, right? So, similarly, the model distillation extracts the essence of a large, complex AI model and turns it into something lightweight, but still highly functional, right? And so you and I have talked about this as an innovation issue, but and what Chinese innovation looks like and means. But this is really a distillation process that's very, very powerful. Um, yeah, so it's a really interesting time.
Well, with all the buzz about DeepSeek, uh, one day that Nvidia dropped $600 billion in its valuation. Do you think the market overreacted?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, the market likely overreacted. I mean, Nvidia's stock drop was more about broader fears of losing access to the Chinese market than the specific impact of DeepSeek's advancements. Additionally, many believed Nvidia's stock was overvalued anyway, and the change could reflect that notion as well. So there's a lot going on, and we're seeing the stock markets are always sort of shaking out and judging based on what people's perceptions of things are, and then they kind of come back to a center point. So it was probably an overreaction, and we're going to see moderation of that. But yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting time, and there was certainly interesting innovation that was happening here, even if it wasn't, you know, as innovative as the original bodies of things like uh, OpenAI and other areas. Clearly, DeepSeek has learned a lot from watching the rest of the world.
Well, let's talk about deep AIs. So since then, Berkeley's AI research group were able to reproduce the DeepSeek model at a much smaller cost, around $30. So tell me a little bit about kind of how that development compares with what DeepSeek has achieved.
So yeah, this is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, Berkeley's research pushes the boundaries of cost efficiency in AI far more than DeepSeek's works. And so, their methods could democratize even the access to AI technologies globally, whereas DeepSeek's contributions remain more incremental, right? But again, this is an interesting space of really pushing the boundaries of what the core technologies are and what incremental advances in the technology are, and DeepSeek's part of that. But the Berkeley AI research team is also doing it, and it's really amazing.
So finally, this really brings us to a larger question about China's struggle with innovation, particularly inventions. Many of my friends from China have argued that Chinese excel at optimization, so they can make the existing processes much better, but they struggle with the true 0 to 1 innovation. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, you hear about this a lot, and you'll hear about it from Chinese people. Yes, the 0 to 1 innovation is, China struggles with that a little bit, but they're very good at the incremental developments, and so 1 to 100. And so you get a lot of more improvements in many areas, and you can maybe see that in these high tech areas like DeepSeek and AI. And you probably also see similar ideas, when people talk about innovation in manufacturing supply chains and other spaces. Um, I don't love this argument because I think China is in a very powerful position right now, and they're doing very, very well at changing the world and innovating in fundamental ways. Um, but, there is an argument, and there are many people in both industry, but also even in academia. When I used to be a dean of a business school and was developing programs in China, there is this notion that one of the things that makes America so powerful at 0 to 1 is that so much of our education system is built on liberal arts and creativity. And so even if you're an engineer, you have to think about, opening your mind to thinking about creative ways to approaching different problems of analyzing texts and coming up with new ideas. And, when we were developing programs in China, it is common that some of the most prestigious universities like Tsinghua and other places, they think very carefully about the technology piece of it and about manufacturing excellence in engineering, but the creativity piece is not as much there. And so I think that 0 to 1 piece really relies on educating young students in ideas of creativity. Whether you're in science or engineering or technology, you still need creative thinking. I mean, Steve Jobs used to famously say this, right? I mean, what was his quote? His quote is,
Apple exists at the intersection of
yeah,
art and science
yeah,
technology.
exactly. Yeah. So I'm glad you remembered it. I should have remembered that, but yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Interesting, talking to a lot of mainland Chinese friends, a lot of them saying because of the competition in school, you can't risk having one mistake. So students become, it's not that they're less creative, they're just risk averse because you can't come back from that one mistake. Whereas we in the American education system, you can get a C and then still do well later in life. So there's not a lot of risk in failing. And in fact, Silicon Valley, where I'm based, really reward learning from your mistakes. So if you're a failed entrepreneur, you can still get funded by venture capitalists.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, we have a narrative about that. There's the Steve Jobs thing, the intersection of art and technology, but there's also just the general sense, like, if you have a really talented, smart, young employee, who came out of a, good educational background or even not, but is clearly a talented person and they make some mistakes, we have a whole managerial and coaching system that talks about the idea that, you want people to take risks. You don't want them to take crazy risks, but you want people to be creative, take risks, and, failure is as good of a lesson book as great success. And so, in my world, and not just as an educator, but also as an executive coach, one of the things we really try to push managers and leaders to think about is how do you create the conditions for the most uh, creative workspace you can build, and allowing people to take risks and fail and not lose their jobs because of it is an important part of that.
Well, do you see this changing in China in the next decade where folks are encouraged to fail so they will give 0 to 1 innovation a lot more opportunity to try?
So it's a great question. And, again, these are very, very subtle things where you can create the conditions under which, or create the statements and, uh, coach people to be better about this. But, I don't know. I mean, you would have to see a lot of changes in the educational system. I mean, I just mentioned the field of executive coaching. One of my favorite Chinese collaborators from many years ago, and one of the famous executive coaches in China today is an individual named Xiao Zhixing. And, he's a brilliant, brilliant individual. He's a great position in the a great person in the leadership field and the executive coaching field, and probably is one of the most famous young executive coaches in China right now. Um, he had his training. He got his PhD at INSEAD, and so he has international training. So he was really kind of built around the idea of absorbing what the West does, and so this language is out there, and I know it's out there among some, and you also have a lot of organizations that are taking strong positions in China in the academic space. But, a lot would have to change with the testing system and the entry system and the ways in which education happens beginning at a very young age. And so I don't know the answer, Christine, but I do know that there are a lot of people in China who think about innovation a lot, like a lot of Chinese leaders. I mean, that's a big word. It's an important word in Chinese. And so, it has to be the case that people at Xi Jinping's level and on down are thinking a lot about this. It's just a question of, can you change the mindset without radically changing the education system? And that I just don't know.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you, Doug. This has been such an enlightening discussion. Personally, I love AI. I worked in AI back in even college and the first job out of college. So thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for tuning in China in the News. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe for more in depth conversation on stories shaping U.S. China relations. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Christine. So good to talk to you as always.
Bye bye.